Today, our very own Adam Sabota is going to be discussing red teaming, threat adversary simulation, offensive security tool sets, scripts, frameworks, the timeline of an attack, and a bunch of other cool stuff. In the interest of giving him ample time, I'm going to do some quick intro slides, and then we'll get to the fun stuff. So let's do it. All right, so anybody that's worked with Eagle for any amount of time, you know we're pretty proud of the fact that we've been in the industry for 40 years. We put a lot of focus on long-term relationships. We're heavily staffed from an engineering perspective. We're different because we maintain a best-of-breed mentality. That means that we go out there and we do constant due diligence and we figure out which solutions offer the best value for our customer, as opposed to a kind of buffet style, you know, what do you want to buy mentality. And then we support on a pre-sale side, on a post-sale side, and we want to have this cradle-to-grave mentality so we can help you be successful throughout the whole product life cycle or the whole solution life cycle. So we take our credibility pretty seriously, and we're pretty proud of how the organization's been built and evolved, and we really like to help our customers make smart IT decisions. So how did we get here today where we're doing all of these cybersecurity webinars? Real quick history lesson. We've been helping customers protect their intellectual property or their data, or what I call it today, you're protecting your house for decades, right? Naturally, it evolves over time, and we've evolved. We talk a lot more nowadays about cloud backup initiatives, data governance, and of course, more recently, immutability of your snapshots. Some time ago, we also recognized how important Tier 1 storage was as it relates to being integrated in your backups. Very early on, before any of the vendors caught on, we wrote something called SAN Toolkit, which allowed our customers to use snapshots for large restores and cloning operations. It was pretty cutting edge at the time, kind of table stakes now, but it just goes to show how we've always been striving to be transformative and help our customers. Naturally, if you can help customers manage their data, have responsible recovery objectives, right, be able to back up and restore quickly, you're good at business continuity and disaster recovery conversations. And it was through really those three pillars that we started working more at helping our customers with security. It was maybe 5 years ago that we started to see a shift where the majority of recoveries that we helped customers with weren't related to user error and data corruption, but were related to things like ransomware and bad actors. And of course, you don't have to work with too many customers where they restore their data only to find out they haven't closed the hole or the bad actor's still in the environment to understand how important it was to help with security posture as well. So that's kind of what got us here. In terms of solutions and core offerings, you know, I don't want to not mention once again that backup and recovery is an important part of your security posture. A lot of security firms don't talk about it because they don't have that specialty. That's something we've done a long time. Over 3 years ago, we partnered with Arctic Wolf. They're particularly good at offering value with our small to medium business size customers that don't have dedicated security teams. They add a lot of expertise and they help identify bad actors and threats that are inside your environment. We've also started to build out our own solutions. Adam, who's going to be talking today, heads up this initiative. We offer different styles of penetration testing, security hardening, and best practices. We're going to be talking about some of that throughout this webinar. And then finally, one reason I like working at Eagle is we recognize when we need a little bit of help to help our customers. And so we partnered with Kudelski Security some time ago because they have a very deep security bench and they help us help our customers with things like incident response, among other things. So we vetted them out for about 18 months. They didn't think we were actually going to partner with them, but that's just how Eagle works. And it's been a great partnership so far.
All right, so I'll let you take it here from the introductions. You see that okay, Ryan?
Yep, looking good.
Okay, so my name is Adam Swoboda, Principal Cybersecurity Strategist at Eagle. I've been with Eagle for a long time, coming up on 8 years actually. in June of this year. So I started as a software engineer and really moved into the cloud side of things, working on architecting a scalable S3 platform that we could use and host for our cloud backups, as well as DR as a service. And I've been really passionate about information security for many years. So I'm excited that Eagle's given me this opportunity, and we have the talent now on staff where we can really dedicate all of my time and a lot of time towards cybersecurity and helping our customers. It's a really important aspect of business that's getting more and more attention now, unfortunately for the wrong reasons. Normally after you get hacked is when the checkbooks open. But we're here today to talk about red teaming and proactive security. So also known as offensive security. So how can you be proactive? And what are people doing today? Like, what hackers are out there? What modern tactics are they using to attack your network? How can you prepare for something like that? So this is part 2 of our cybersecurity webinar series. Part 3, we're going to discuss how to build a basic modern security defense. So this is going to include very low-hanging fruit things you can check in your Windows Active Directory environment, as well as the bare minimum of what you should have in play for log aggregation and endpoint monitoring. So I think that's going to be a really fun one for a lot of our customers. There's a lot of really great open source software out there that doesn't require too much babysitting. It's some basic steps you can take if you have literally nothing. So that's going to be a really fun one. And then in part 4, we're kind of tying it all together. And I'm really going to do a deep dive and focus on Eagle's different offerings, including our penetration testing offerings. So we like to kick this off by talking about legendary hacks of the past. And this one's going to be a little different, kind of. So in the previous webinar, we talked about Stuxnet. And I'm sure many of you or most of you have heard about that one. But today we're going to talk about a hacking group. And this hacking group was known as LulzSec, or Lulz Security. And they really gained a lot of notoriety in 2011, where for a couple months, they hacked many high-profile targets, particularly impressive targets. And at the very end of their stint, they hacked the FBI and the CIA and the US Senate and ended up announcing that they were retiring right after that because they were gaining a lot of heat. But this one's really nostalgic for me because I was about 17, 18 at the time, and I was following them really closely in IRC channels. They were heavily covered in mainstream media. It was kind of this craze. The anonymous hacking group had started to take shape at that time. So this was an interesting thing for info security in general, because we had these hackers who were hacking high profile targets, but they weren't doing it for any financial gain and not even really for any political gain. It was just for the lulz, or quite literally for the laughs. They were just having fun by causing mayhem. So this is a timeline, and we're not going to read all of this stuff here, but you can see they started mid-May of 2011. They hacked PBS and ran some fake news stories. They hacked Sony Japan, a bunch of ATMs in the UK. They hacked Fox and leaked a bunch of user accounts and information. And then throughout June and the previous half of May, they called this the 50 days of lulz, or the 50 days of hacks. They went through and just dropped a bunch of information from really high profile targets. They had Sony Pictures International, Nintendo, a lot of game studio websites. They actually took PlayStation Network offline for 44 days, which costed Sony an estimated $180 million, I believe. And yeah, towards the end, they moved on to the US government. And it was later in June where the US government had announced that British police arrested one of the 5 main members. And that's how, after that, LulzSec kind of announced that they were disbanding. And by March of 2012, the FBI said 5 people had been arrested that, were of interest. So LulzSec kind of started. LulzSec didn't, I guess, start, but in conjunction with Anonymous, one of the high-profile hacking groups at the time, it kind of just started this wave. And there's a quote from The Atlantic I put on the slide that I think sums it up. But when they say 2011 was the year of the hack, it really was. Anonymous became a household name. And it was interesting because it showed the public that hackers don't always fit certain stereotypes, and they're not always IT nerds behind a computer. But if you get enough people together under a common cause, and that they're organized, you can take down these big corporations who have billion-dollar balance sheets, just find holes in their security. And yeah, it was pretty impressive. I think it's something that everyone should know about, and I'm sure many of you have heard about them. I like to move on now and talk about an insane hack of 2021. So there were a few here I was debating between, but I think, hands down, the trophy has to go to ProxyLogon. And this is one that I'm sure most of you have heard of, but it was a pre-authentication vulnerability in Exchange, meaning you didn't have to have valid credentials to exploit it. And what would happen is you could exploit Exchange and gain remote code execution on the box. So you may have also heard of this attack called the Hafnium attack, and Hafnium is the name that they've given to this malicious actor group that was behind the initial attack. So fundamentally, we're looking at an attack that worked on all mainstream Exchange versions since 2013, and basically gave them full admin access to run code, however they would like to on your Exchange box, as long as Outlook Web Access was exposed to the internet, which I think most people have that exposed to the internet. So Microsoft patched this on March 3rd, and that's when they publicly disclosed it, I believe. So, this was a busy day for Eagle. We had to spend a lot of time. We run Exchange on-prem 2016, and we had to spend a lot of time going through and doing some forensic analysis and making sure that we weren't actually exploited by that. It turns out we were hit by that vulnerability, just like most exposed Exchange servers in the United States were. And it looked to be more of a probe, not an actual exploit. But that's what we spent the next 3 or 4 days, validating internally. So the thing that's really rare about this attack is presumably it came from a nation state. Like they said, the attribution is Hafnium, which we think is from China. And this is unique because normally if you have a 0-day as good as this or as dangerous as this, you don't burn it how they burned it, right? Like you don't blindly spray every Exchange server in the United States and try to pop a web shell on it, try to backdoor it. So, there must have been something going on. Maybe the nation state knew that their exploit was about to get patched. So they knew they had a limited amount of time to use it. And really, it was kind of a sloppy way to go about doing it, just massively spraying, because you're going to make a lot of noise. And they did make a lot of noise. They got a lot of people scared. And I mean, this exploit was so bad that the FBI actually got permission from a judge to essentially hack all US Exchange infrastructure with the ProxyLogon vulnerability and use that vulnerability to remove the backdoors that were placed there by Hafnium or whatever bad actor deployed the backdoor. So that's the first time in history I can ever remember hearing about the FBI acting as a cybersecurity incident responder for like all of the US public for free. Really
Yeah, and
weird.
Adam, there were just as many articles talking about the precedent that set, right?
Yeah. It makes really you wonder. It really makes you wonder going forward, and how the legal system is going to look at high profile hacks like this, and especially ones that are this bad. If the FBI or maybe another government agency is going to start playing more of an active role in helping trying to clean some of these up. This one was just targeting Exchange. I mean, you're targeting top critical infrastructure, plus pretty much everyone's running Exchange. So yeah, if you have Exchange on-prem, that was a rough one. And I do want to mention before we talk a little more about this, that earlier this month, there were 2 more pre-auth Exchange RC 0 days reported by the NSA and patched by Microsoft. So if you guys had to patch ProxyLogon with on-prem Exchange and you haven't updated it since, you really want to look at that. I would get on that ASAP. The NSA, I think, probably was sitting on these vulnerabilities if I had to guess, and this might have forced their hand. Maybe they're worried more people are looking into this part of Exchange. They're worried that these vulnerabilities will be exploited in the wild. So I had another slide here, just we're going to go through these pretty quick. At Eagle, what did we do? This slide doesn't include even 10% of what we did, but it's important that you look at some of the very basics. So the first thing that I checked personally is I wanted to know if we were backdoored and what the extent of that backdoor was. So PowerShell is great. It allows me with this script up here, I can query the Active Directory for any user that was created within the past 30 days. And this is one of the first things we look at after any sort of incident, because it's pretty common for a bad actor to create a backdoor account. There's plenty of other ways to backdoor Active Directory permissions without making an account. Making a new user is actually very noisy, but it's still very common. So, we check basic things like that. And then Microsoft, I believe it was Microsoft, released that test ProxyLogon script that would, using the Exchange PowerShell management CLI, you can pipe your list of Exchange servers into it, and it will go through and see if it thinks you were affected by ProxyLogon by looking at logs, and I think looking for web shell files. Later they updated it. So we ran that many times, did a lot of manual investigation. And then, just another pro tip, check the box, give me updates for other Microsoft products when I update Windows on your Exchange server. If you do have this checked, you can get some of the security update KBs as long as you are on the appropriate cumulative update pack. If you are behind, you probably won't get that over Windows Update, but it's easier to fall behind if your Windows Update is not checking for Exchange updates when you run it. So that's something to make sure you look at. And what does some of this look like when we look at defensive tools and infrastructure? So Crowdstrike, very popular name. Crowdstrike has an EDR product called Falcon. And here you can kind of see, the attack was mapped out. Crowdstrike Falcon actually detected this attack. It was a 0-day attack, meaning there was no known, the attack had never been discovered, so there was no definition or any way to detect or signature the attack. But just by the behavior alone, Crowdstrike Falcon could pick up and block the attack. And it saw w3wp.exe, which is the host process for like Outlook Web Access, was running. It spawned a child process, the command line compiler, to start compiling DLLs or something for a web shell or a backdoor. And so, yeah, if you had an EDR product, I would love to talk to you and see if that helped you, if you were probed, if your EDR product picked up on that. But that's a cool example of the future that I think we all see in EDR, and just the pure benefit to having EDR over AV alone is that you're going to get that behavioral detection, and you don't have to wait for someone to release a signature in an update file. All right, so we're going to dive in and talk about red teaming, which is the core focus of this webinar. Again, red teaming is the activity of simulating adversary threat tactics within your environment. So we want to identify any gaps in your organization's defenses, and we want to give you a modern simulation of what you can expect from a real attack. So here, you've probably heard of red team versus blue team. There's also purple team, which is a hybrid of both. We'll talk a little bit more about that in webinar part 3. But again, red team, like I mentioned before, it's proactive security. So you're going through and you're actively attempting these tactics and techniques against your environment, and you're figuring out where your weaknesses are, where you need to focus, and where your organization really needs to budget its resources to help build the defenses. One part of red teaming is OSINT. Some people say OSINT. It stands for Open Source Intelligence. And open source intelligence is critical when we start a red team engagement against a company, because a lot of the times when we start a penetration test engagement, the customer and we, we both want to go in with zero knowledge, because the less I know about your company before I try to hack it, the more realistic of a simulation it is. So we look at the public internet. What information can I find that anyone could find on the public internet? And the low hanging fruit, we hit the company website, we get the employees, the employee job titles, employee email accounts if they're there, then we'll cross-reference that with LinkedIn. We use Google Dorking. There's software called Maltego that uses these APIs to ingest from a ton of different public sources. And we really just go through and we pull all the information we can about your organization and its assets. And we consider your employees one of your organization's biggest assets. So what are your employees putting out there on the public internet? What's on their social media? Are they signing up with other websites with their work email address? And have one of those websites been compromised in the past? Have I been pwned is a great way to get a foothold in a company. We see this many times. People register accounts on other websites using a company email and a password that is the same as what they use at work, or it's, has something tacked onto it. It's a little tweak of the original password. And once you know what service has been compromised, you can find the database dump that leaked online, and then we have a credential. So that's a really common way that people get in. And OSINT is critical to the success of an engagement. The more information that we can find before we touch your environment, the better chance I have at staying inside your environment. OSINT gives me so much information about even sometimes what antivirus, EDR, email filtering product you have before I'm even in your environment. I can find that all on, maybe someone's posted on a forum, some employees posted on a vendor forum for help with an EDR product. I can assume you run that EDR, you've tried it. We can look at your DNS records to see if you're using Proofpoint or any of those other email filtering providers. And we use all of that data to try to craft and weaponize the perfect payload or phishing attack that's going to have the highest success rate in your. Okay, so we're going to dive into some red team tools. And this part was a little challenging for me because I didn't want it to get too technical for everyone. I wanted everyone to be able to understand it. So I look forward to your feedback at the end of the presentation. I'm always looking to improve here, but I try to go with the good mix of both. I think both people will appreciate. So one of the core tools in any red teamer's toolkit is a C2 framework, and C2 stands for, it's short for command and control. So these are how red team operators maintain persistence in your network, usually also how they move laterally in your network, gain privileges, and perform any internal reconnaissance that they're looking for. So this slide kind of goes over a common C2 framework deployment. You can look at the firewall edge and then the internet. So everything to the right of the globe is infrastructure that Eagle runs. So we have our red team operator, which would be me or Connor or other employees. And we have a central C2 server. This sits behind a couple of redirectors. And what the redirectors do is they're either going to proxy a legitimate website in front of the C2, or they are going to try to detect any security researcher traffic or anyone poking around that's not actually part of our payload. And they're going to try to fool them into thinking it's not a C2 server. So that just kind of buys us time from all of those automated port scans and detectors out there on the internet that are always scanning for these servers and marking them, in a blacklist somewhere. So we kind of set up a bunch of infrastructure, and then, behind the firewall edge, this is what exists within your company. If you're being pen tested, you have our payload running on multiple compromised machines. And typically it just starts out from one machine. Someone clicked on an email that they shouldn't have clicked on, ran an attachment, or we just compromised their credentials. And it will start to spread laterally in your environment. So we like to leave a small footprint at the edge. Typically, we only have a couple machines actually reaching out and talking to us over the internet. And all of the other connectivity happens inside your environment through TCP sockets or disguised as SMB, just using Windows named pipes. And that's typically how we have it set up. So there's a couple C2 frameworks I really wanted to talk about. And this is Cobalt Strike. It's kind of our go-to C2 framework of choice. We have a couple other options we use when we can't use this one. But I mean, this has been around for quite some time. It's very stable. It has very good pivoting, and the beacon's really extensible. It allows Eagle to do a lot with it, a lot of customization. So
Adam,
yeah.
what's a beacon? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So beacon is like the malicious payload. Within Cobalt Strike, it's called a beacon. And a beacon is what we deploy to computers that, the beacon code is what compromises the machine. So yeah, within Cobalt Strike, you have the concept of beacons, and you install these beacons on different Windows machines within an environment. And these beacons communicate, they phone home to you, and they give you the option to execute code, execute command, take a screenshot, control the remote desktop if you want. I mean, there's a lot of techniques built into Cobalt Strike that we can use. So here's another Cobalt Strike screenshot. You can see here on the left. This is an example of moving laterally through a Windows environment. On the left, Cobalt Strike has a list of targets, which I discovered on the network just by looking at the netview command. And that uses, I think it looks at the ARP table to find IP addresses of other clients on the local network. And once you've kind of identified these, assuming you've captured some Windows credentials, whether you've actually got a working username or password, or you just have an NTLM hash or some type of Kerberos ticket that you can use, you can, in Cobalt Strike, it's as simple as right-clicking on one of these machines and then picking a lateral execution method. So Windows has a plethora of remote management protocols. There's PSExec, Windows RM, PowerShell remoting, as well as WMI, and probably even more that I'm not thinking of. So this just, it gives us an all-in-one toolkit that we can use to pivot and move through your environment and extract the information we want. One interesting fact is that 65% of all ransomware attacks that happened in Q3 of 2020 use Cobalt Strike. So the bad guys use it too. It's built for the good guys, but it's really so good that most of the bad guys prefer it as well. So it is an accurate way to simulate an adversary against your environment to use Cobalt Strike, because if you do get compromised by a bad actor, there's a very high chance they're probably using it as well. So it's fun to test your defenses against that and make sure that the technology you have in-house is detecting a product like that. Alternative to Cobalt Strike, if you don't want to pay $3,500 a year, I think is what it is per user. There's Covenant, which is open source. You can download it on GitHub. I love this framework. It's my personal go-to when doing engagements if Cobalt Strike is not an option and if the client has a smaller network. Covenant has some stability issues. They're still kind of working out the kinks there, but it's super flexible. It does almost everything Cobalt Strike does, give or take a few networking features. There's no built-in SOX proxy. And I think the pivoting stability, leaves some to be desired, but it's getting there. It's definitely worth looking into. And a few other tools I just want to throw out there. Mimikatz, many of you have probably heard about this. It's been around for quite a while, but it's a Windows password recovery tool that is still used today and the majority of red team engagements against the Windows AD environment, because it's so effective at extracting those credentials, not only from memory, but it can do DC sync, pull them from the domain controller. I think it can read the NTS tit file, or I can't remember what it is, but there's all sorts of tools and tricks it can use to pull hashes and credentials from Windows. Hashcat is used a lot for anything that, any hash that you can crack offline. So I run this with an RTX 2080, and if the password's pretty weak and we're looking at an ASREP or a Kerberos type 5, or like a weaker hash like MD5 or something like that we've recovered from a database dump somewhere. It's pretty quick to crack those hashes. And then of course, we make a lot of use of PowerShell and just the commands and protocols built into Windows itself.
So Adam, are these the exact same tools that bad actors use, or they do something different?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna find bad actors like nation states with bigger checkbooks are gonna tend to go with a lot of custom stuff, 0 days that haven't been released to the public or anything like that. But even they use Cobalt Strike. There's nation state attacks that have used Cobalt Strike. I think the reason they use it is because Cobalt Strike is such a good framework and a foundation for a malicious payload, and it gives you the extensibility you need to build on top of it. You can totally hide the way Cobalt Strike behaves on a network. You can make it look like Zoom. You can make the network traffic look like, Azure, Office 365. You can emulate the network traffic profile or protocol of any legitimate app you want, and then you can totally change the behavior of Cobalt Strike down to the Windows API calls it's using to inject code and just how it behaves. So it just gives you a crazy powerful framework to build on. And
scary would be another word, to be honest.
It is scary. I wanted to spend some time today talking about antivirus and EDR evasion because this is a cat and mouse game, but it's shocking how easy a lot of this stuff is to evade for an attacker, and it's getting harder every day, especially with EDR and behavioral based detection. But some of the basic things that we look at, that Eagle looks at as we're trying to deploy a malicious payload in an environment is, we don't want to be picked up by the antivirus, and we don't want to be picked up by the EDR, especially not on initial executions, which matter the most. So we have this payload, maybe it's delivered to you in some weaponized phishing campaign, or we've gained credentials and we've gotten in your environment and executed it somehow. One of the first things we do is we disable the anti-malware scan interface. This is a layer within Windows that kind of sits in between program input and output calls. So like PowerShell, for example, when you create a PowerShell process, Windows loads the AMSI DLL into your process space, and then anything you type into PowerShell gets scanned. So, and it gets scanned with whatever anti-malware provider is installed on the machine. So your stock Windows 10 machine, it's going to get scanned with Windows Defender. And Windows Defender is getting pretty good. Their string-based detection, you can still bypass it like with any AV, but it's definitely better than nothing. And it's going to scan all the input with the exported functions from the AMSI DLL. So AMSI scan buffer is a big one, scan string. And if it detects anything malicious, it's going to stop the program from actually executing it. So a lot of programs use that and can use that interface in Windows. And you can detect this too fairly easily, because if AMSI blocks something, it will write an event ID 1116, I believe, to the event log. So if you have a SIM or endpoint logging in place, you can detect this stuff really quick. And it's pretty easy to bypass. There's a ton of ways to bypass AMSI. And since it's just scanning for signatures or specific strings, oftentimes you can just obfuscate your strings and the code and defeat the scanning engine. What most people will do now is just patch one of the AMSI functions, like the AMSI scan buffer function. So there's a library to do this. There's a ton of libraries to do this, but one is called SharpBlock, and it disables AMSI by actually setting a hardware breakpoint on the process that's triggered when AMSI is initializing. And when that breakpoint is hit, it changes the instruction pointer of the caller of the initialize, or it changes the instruction pointer back to the caller of the initialize function, and changes the return value to tell you that AMSI is disabled for this process. So it will never even attempt to use AMSI. Other times people just hook the actual AMSI scan buffer function and manipulate it that way. But, a lot of common techniques for getting around that. And EDR is, another one that we have to deal with. And this one's significantly more difficult to deal with than antivirus. So what is EDR, endpoint detection and response? The goal of EDR is to have real-time monitoring to catch attacks in progress faster than you would be able to do with traditional logging, SIMs, and antivirus. So EDR, EDR by itself isn't really a replacement for a SIM. You will hear the acronym XDR, which is, kind of a combination of EDR and a SIM-like interface. So that's another confusing thing you might hear. But EDR by itself, typically, we see it hooking API calls and all the new processes that are made, and then monitoring its actual behavior. So the typical workflow for an antivirus product is to scan, detect, and remove. And you detect based on a static definitions file that you just downloaded in the morning. And with EDR, they have scan, detect, remove functionality, but the meat of their focus is looking at the actual behavior of the process. What is the process doing when you run it? What files is it touching, deleting, encrypting? What processes is it creating? What are those processes doing? So you're capturing the entire behavioral tree and footprint of a process and making a real-time call on it by, checking its attack techniques against an AI that's often in the cloud. So, they're lightweight on the endpoint because they're not consuming a lot of resources. A lot of the decision-making is offloaded to a server running in the cloud. So how do you defeat EDR? Well, one of the most common ones, which is actually really outdated today, in my opinion, is block DLLs. And if you haven't heard of that, basically what happens in Windows is when you create a process, you can apply a process creation mitigation policy, which tells Windows that your process is only allowed to load DLLs if they're signed by Microsoft, cryptographically signed by Microsoft. So there was this trick, that, oh, hey, with our malware, we can just apply a process creation mitigation policy, and we only want signed Microsoft DLLs to be loaded into our malware. So what happened then when the EDRs try to inject their DLL, they get blocked by Windows itself. Windows is like, yo, they only take Microsoft DLLs, see ya. So this was really popular when it came out, and everyone was all over this one because it totally evaded most EDRs. They couldn't get their DLL loaded, so they had no way to hook and monitor the behavior of the process space. Today, this doesn't really help you too much because Microsoft has this program, and through the program, I would say almost every EDR vendor can get DLLs signed. They can get their DLLs signed by Microsoft. So, Crowdstrike, SentinelOne, this doesn't stop them at all. They can bypass this. Their DLLs are signed by Microsoft. Another common evasion technique for EDRs is actually when you spawn your process and EDR loads its DLL to hook the behavioral API functions that you're going to be running, you can load a clean version of NTDLL, which is the DLL that they're often hooking these functions from. You can load a clean one into a newly spawned process and do some magic to kind of copy over the bytes of the cleaned one to yours, and then call the functions as you normally would, but presumably they would no longer be hooked because you kind of overwrote the hooks. Sometimes people will go in and actually manually search for hooks and try to unhook them. And another technique is you can avoid using those API calls entirely and trying to use direct syscalls. There's still some challenges with syscalls, but we have a couple methods today to get a payload to bypass and at least get initial execution on a lot of these EDR products. The challenge is after you have gained that execution and identified what product you're working with, the challenge then is understanding what you can do and what behaviors you can do that are not going to trigger red flag and burn your cover. So that's a big challenge there with EDR.
And Adam, I just want to add that when I do due diligence calls with you on EDRs, like the statement you always make that makes my blood run a little cold is, I can't wait to get my hands on it so I can bypass it, right? Because I know there's other Adams out there that are trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it can be kind of difficult to get a trial of some EDR products. They want to sell you it and they want to make sure like you're someone that they want to sell it to. So it's always fun to get one. I mean, you know, the more products we can test our evasion against, the better, the more we learn. So bringing that kind of back to antivirus evasion, once we have a red team payload that we're comfortable with for an engagement, and again, this is usually something like a Crowdstrike payload, we typically will output that in a blob of position independent shellcode that we can store in a byte array. So for you low-level coders or C coders, you know, it's just a byte array of the bytes that go into our payload, and we can take that byte array and read it and run it in memory somehow. So Eagle has this loader program that we use. And the goal of the loader program is to take the Crowdstrike executable, which is heavily detected out of the box by the majority of AV and EDR, and obfuscate that and encrypt it and store it within another binary in a way that we can read it, decrypt it at runtime, and execute it in memory and avoid a lot of detection. So that kind of takes care of step one. You know, we end up with a working loader and a way to evade that initial detection and get the code running. And step two is really, you know, doing a lot of internal reconnaissance and understanding what behaviors we're allowed to make in the environment. So this tool in the top left here is called Threat Check, and this is an open source tool on GitHub that's really cool for antivirus evasion. And how it works is, you know, since a lot of antivirus just work by trying to find a signature or a string that exists in the binary, Threat Check will go through and it will split up your binary into a bunch of small chunks, and then it will scan each chunk with Windows Defender. And then, you know, you have a quick way of finding out, oh, I have two tiny chunks of my executable that are detected by Defender. And you get, you know, here it's showing the hexadecimal output, and you can see the ASCII string output on the right. So, you know, what would happen if maybe I change the name of one of my strings, or I change how this output looks and then scan it again? So it's a very iterative process that we go through. You know, scan the file, look at the detection, find out what's being detected and how, tweaking it until it's not detected. And I mean, it's a constant battle. The detections change every time. It really is difficult and can be pretty tedious to keep up with a payload. But we have a pretty good workflow and some automation with GitLab and CI that we can automate a lot of this. And then, you know, there's still quite a bit of manual activity that we have to do on the payload once it's generated. But, you know, just to give you an idea of what's out there, there's a lot of open source tools out there that will help you defeat Windows Defender pretty easily. Okay, so I wanted to put a slide in here about modern phishing attacks. If you guys were a part of the first webinar, we talked about the very basics of a phishing attack. You know, normally something like an email with a malicious attachment or a macro or like an HTML app file, just convincing somebody to run an exe that they shouldn't, things of that nature. And, you know, really, if you're building a modern phishing attack these days, you're probably not going to go with that route. That route's having less and less success as these defensive tools get better. So one of the most scary things that's been around forever and still works quite well is capturing credentials from like Office 365. So try to picture this. A user gets an email message that looks 100% legitimate. The email message contains a link. The link is modified to make it look like it goes to a website they are familiar with, such as the Office 365 logon page. And when they click the link, it actually takes them to the Office 365 logon page, but it's being redirected and proxied through this software called EvilGenX2 that is capturing and intercepting all of the traffic in the middle. So it's a man-in-the-middle attack. So you've actually clicked a bad link that you thought was a good link, but after you loaded the bad link, it looks completely legitimate. It's going to have a real SSL certificate. The URL is going to be very close to the URL you were expecting to see. So if you don't catch that right off the bat, you're probably not going to catch anything else. The beauty of these type of attacks is we can host them behind Azure CDN. So you can host these in the Azure cloud with a .azureedge.net domain, and it makes it really difficult for sysadmin or IT workers to, even prevent this from happening, because they're not going to block traffic going to azureedge.net. I mean, that would bring down a little slice of the internet for their employees. So the beauty of an attack like this is now that the real Office 365 page is being proxied through our Evil Nginx box back to the user enters their username and password and they hit enter. And hopefully Office 365 responds back and it asks for their one-time token or whatever, token-based multi-factor authentication that they're using. And they put the token in and they authenticate with Office 365 just fine. And Office 365 returns us a valid session ID that passes through our proxy and then gets proxy back to the customer. So as the client who just got owned, everything looks normal. You logged in, you entered your two-factor, you're logged in, you're fine. You don't even second guess it. And at that point, we can, after a successful login, we can have the proxy cut out and just redirect you back to the real Office 365. Sometimes that can cause problems if you aren't logged into the real one. And then you're like, what? I just logged in. But you can kind of bail at the end there too. So this is scary because this is a phishing attack that gets us a user session and it totally bypasses MFA. Like the fact that you have MFA does not stop a phishing attack like this, because with a man-in-the-middle proxy that captures that valid session ID, we can just replay that session ID to Azure, and now we're logged in as that user. So this is how most modern phishing attacks are going to look at a very basic level. They're going to try to capture your credentials and sessions, and they're going to do it even if you use multi-factor auth. So a couple of things I want to say. My slide didn't get updated here, but I want to credit this slide to Ralph May at Black Hills Information Security. They did a really awesome PowerPoint about modern phishing simulation and just, creating a modern phishing attack that I recommend anyone look in if they want more details. But this slide, I had to take it because it was so cool and it really summed it up pretty neatly, I thought. But credit to them. And then second, you will hear about phish-proof MFA. It's a big marketing point right now. And the idea that they're trying to solve with phish-proof multi-factor auth is that maybe you won't typically have to input a code. So instead of having to input a code, you get a push notification to your mobile device and you must manually accept or authorize with it. But the key part that makes it phish-proof is that the client adds a location identifier of where the user came from. So this location identifier will actually mismatch because it's not pointing at the real Office 365 URL. It's going to be pointed at our proxy. And the MFA should be rejected when it realizes that you came from a bad domain. So phish-proof MFA is a way to stop these phishing-based credential attacks for sure. But yeah, those are the ones you got to be worried about, is the websites that look and act and behave completely legitimate, because you could be logging into a completely legitimate site. You just have someone sitting in between you and the site that's now capturing everything. So talk a little bit about Windows security. This is the last section. So we're doing pretty good on time. Just going to go over some low-hanging fruit, like as a red teamer, what am I looking for in your Windows environment that's stupid obvious or that's enabled by default that maybe you never disabled? And what tool do I use to help me with that? So here, we always like looking at the low-hanging fruit. This is stuff that I'm sure is might not be news to a lot of you guys. But in Windows AD environments, we love to see if we can capture any NTLM v2 hashes, since we can use those and pass the hash attacks. So in Windows, if you can get an NTLM v2 hash, it's pretty much as good as having a username and password, because the hash itself is all you need to authenticate to anything within the directory that supports NTLM v2 auth. So the majority of network authentication in modern Windows AD environments is actually Kerberos as opposed to NTLM v2. But I would say the majority of organizations that I've looked at least don't disable NTLM v2, and this is usually due to some old software or old devices that just don't support Kerberos auth. Like maybe you're still hanging on to NTLM v2 because you have that one printer that prints really well that you like, but it doesn't have an update to support Kerberos. So you're really bringing the security of your network down by keeping that enabled, but it's still common. So there's this protocol called LLMNR, Link Local Multicast Name Resolution, which is enabled by default in Active Directory. And it allows Windows hosts to do their own form of name resolution and host discovery without DNS. So if you're on LAN, there's a lot of blind trust there. Like basically you can ask for the file server, and I could be the fake file server and tell you I'm the real one and intercept the hash that you send to authenticate with the file server. Another one that people don't check for, that people let go, is DNS hijacking with IPv6. If you have a Windows environment and you have IPv6 enabled on the machines, but you're not actually using IPv6, something can go in there, get an IPv6 on your network and start hosting DNS. And then we can start doing all sorts of crazy stuff like redirecting Windows computers to our honeypot or our man in the middle and intercepting their hashes or any sort of authentication challenges that they're trying to do. And there's a relay attack picture on the bottom from OXDF's blog. And it just, shows you as an attacker, we kind of sit in the middle and we ask the client to give us a hash that proves it's you. And once they do, we can now impersonate them. So it's as easy as that in a Windows environment. And those are two really key things. If you don't need LLMNR, which you probably don't, if you have internal DNS, disable it. IPv6, same. If you're not using it, disable it or harden it in a way where you have a trusted DNS server that we can't play around with. And then the third thing that we really like to do is look at what your employees are using, what services they're accessing. Can we backdoor a shortcut file or trick an employee into clicking a link that's going to go to an SMB share that we host, and then we can capture their credentials. So I'm going to go to the last slide here real quick. I wanted to talk about this tool, BloodHound, because it's so awesome. It's an open source tool that uses graph theory to map out all the relationships within your AD environment. And I would recommend it to you as an AD admin if you've never heard of it, because it makes it, I know the pictures look kind of complicated, but if you spend 5 minutes kind of understanding what you're seeing, it really makes it easy to understand the permission hierarchy of your AD environment. And maybe you've inadvertently exposed some user to some permission they shouldn't have because you have them belonging to so many embedded, the name slipped me, groups. Just sort of different permissions groups. Groups have different permissions, and depending on how you have those chained together or who's a part of what group, there can be a potential conflict. So one of the things I like to do on BloodHound right off the bat is I use my C2 framework like Crowdstrike or Covenant to package up and extract all of the information in the Active Directory configuration using a tool like SharpHound. And then I exfiltrate that file and I import it into BloodHound. And I run this query, and which you can see in the picture in the bottom left, find shortest path to domain admin. So, on this scenario, you can see in the graph on the right, we've compromised this environment through s.owens workstation. And through here, you can see I'm trying to do the laser pointer. It's not cooperating with me. Yeah, sorry. Maybe if you can see my cursor, it's a bit easier.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, so right here, we've compromised this S.Owen machine with a phishing campaign. And S.Owen is a local admin to this workstation here. So I'm zoomed out in BloodHound and you can't see the name of that workstation. But we're following the red path here, because what this tells us is that we have S.Owen. She's a local admin on this machine, and in.lam has an active session on her machine. That's great news for us, because in.lam is a member of the help desk group, and he's next in our line to try to get to domain admin. So using a tool like Mimikatz, like we talked about before, I can extract in.lam's credentials from memory because he has an active session on S.Owen's box, even if he's like logged out of RDP, but his session's open, right? So I can pull his credentials. Now I'm in LAM, and now I'm help desk. And now I'm a local admin to this workstation that in.glover has a session on. That's another Mimikatz command away from being, having in.glover's permissions, which is a member of domain admin. So BloodHound literally mapped out our attack pattern. It's like, if you want to get domain admin, here's the shortest path you can take. And you can use BloodHound to do insanely powerful queries. You can find big glaring holes in your security in your AD environment just by running some of these pre-built queries. So I would love to talk more about BloodHound. We're gonna dive into it more in part 3, because it's just as important for defense as it is for offense. But Active Directory is really hard to understand if you have an environment that you've been upgrading, especially since functional level 2008 or 2003. And you have defaults that Microsoft enabled back then that just got preserved throughout all the way up to functional level 2016 or whatever you're at. There can be a lot of stuff in there that it's impossible to even see or understand using the AD GUI that Microsoft provides. Like, you need to graph it out sometimes with a tool like this to fully understand.